By the early 80s, the automotive industry had already settled on its direction. Front-wheel drive was rapidly gaining ground, and the engine had firmly moved to the front. But with the new generation of the Transporter, Volkswagen took a different path. When developing the next generation, they kept the rear engine layout, and more than that, retained an air-cooled engine, a decision that already looked outdated at the time. And yet, this van did not fail. It never became as iconic as its predecessor, but it did earn a reputation as a tough and reliable workhorse. And today, we'll take a look at how that even happened. The first Volkswagen vans were conceived as simple, affordable, and utilitarian commercial vehicles, exactly what post-war Europe needed. And while the cargo version fully met those demands, the passenger version quickly moved beyond its purely utilitarian role. By the 60s, these vehicles had become associated with a lifestyle, most notably with the hippie movement, travel, and the idea of freedom. They turned into something like a mobile home on wheels, a vehicle you could take anywhere. And this was despite the fact that the early T1 was extremely basic. It had no turn signals, no radio, no proper ventilation, and not even a fuel gauge. The first Transporter borrowed its drivetrain from the Beetle, and its 1.1-liter air-cooled flat engine produced just 24 horsepower. Up until 1965, the electrical system remained 6-volt, after which it was upgraded to 12-volt. Over time, the vehicle was gradually improved. In 1960, the 1.2-liter engine was increased to 34 horsepower, and the gearbox received synchronizers. A year later, a fuel gauge was added to the dashboard, along with a reserve fuel lever under the driver's seat. The driver's seat itself also changed, replacing the full-width bench with a separate seat. The T1 remained in production until 1967, when it was replaced by the T2. However, in Brazil, at the plant in São Bernardo do Campo, production continued until 1975, although these vehicles were sold only on the domestic market. The successor, T2, largely followed the same engineering principles as the T1. It retained the rear engine layout, rear-wheel drive, and the air-cooled flat engine. But the progress was immediately noticeable. Engines became more powerful, 1.6 liters with 50 horsepower, 1.7 liters with 66 horsepower, and 2 liters with 70 horsepower. A 3-speed automatic transmission also became available, something the T1 never had. The brakes are also worth noting. From 1968, the T2 received a dual-circuit braking system, and from 1970, front disc brakes. As for the design, this is one of the rare cases where a second generation both looks clearly different from the first, yet still instantly communicates its lineage. And there's a clear logic to that. The T2 did not create a new image. It reinforced an existing one, becoming just as popular as its predecessor. Production of the T2 in Germany ended in 1979, while in Brazil it continued until 2013. At the same time, average annual production remained at around 20,000 vehicles. But let's return to Germany in the 70s, to 1973, when development began on the next generation of the van, known as the T3. Volkswagen's naming system is admittedly quite confusing. For example, the third generation is officially designated as T3 Type 2, while the second is Type 2 T2. There are also other designations like T25, and in the American market the model was sold as the Vanagon. So to keep things simple, we'll just refer to them as T1, T2, and T3 by generation. Development of the T3, which started in 1973, initially aimed to move to a front-mounted engine while retaining rear-wheel drive. And less than a year later, in September 1974, a team of engineers led by Gustav Meyer presented the first prototype. The project, known as EA162, marked a significant departure from the earlier bay window models. The front beam suspension was replaced with a more modern double wishbone setup, while the rear adopted a semi-independent layout with trailing arms. However, the prototype ended up with a rear engine layout, just like the production version that followed. This decision was largely driven by pragmatism. By the time development began, Volkswagen already had a whole range of rear engine models, and remained one of the few manufacturers still committed to this layout. Switching to a front-engine design would have required significant time and investment. Meanwhile, the existing platform and engines were already well developed, and production did not need to be completely retooled. At the same time, it's important to understand that this was not a simple carryover of the old design. The T3 was built on a heavily revised platform, and the vehicle itself became noticeably larger, wider, taller, and heavier than its predecessors. Of course, Volkswagen could not bring a vehicle to market with the message, "We simply saved money on development." They had to explain to customers why this layout actually made sense. One of the key arguments was that, under full load, the weight distribution became nearly ideal. This improved traction at the driven wheels and had a positive effect on handling. There was another feature as well. The cargo area of the T3 had a stepped floor, low and flat in the center, but higher at the rear due to the engine. And this too was presented as an advantage. In the area of the side door, where loading and unloading usually takes place, the floor was as convenient as possible. Many competitors simply did not offer anything like it. But all of this came at a cost. A base T3 was priced at around 16,000 Deutschmarks, which was not cheap. For comparison, the Ford Transit, introduced a year earlier, cost about 14,000, while the Bedford CF was around 13,000. And by adding roughly another 2,000, a buyer could step up to the Mercedes T1, a larger and more serious vehicle. The new model was introduced in May 1979. The press and the public reacted in a restrained way, without much excitement, but also without serious criticism. What stood out was the traditionally high build quality, along with a clear improvement in comfort and handling. The T3 received a front suspension with double wishbones and a rear setup with trailing arms, both using coil springs. This significantly changed the character of the vehicle. The T3 felt much more stable on the road and leaned less in corners compared to earlier Transporter models. At the same time, it retained a smooth and comfortable ride. At launch, the T3 was offered in several body styles: a panel van, a single cab or double cab pickup, and a passenger bus. All versions were equipped with air-cooled gasoline engines, available in 1.6 or 2.0 liters. There was some criticism as well. Not everyone understood why Volkswagen continued to stick with the rear engine layout, which imposed certain limitations in everyday use. On top of that, the air-cooled engines struggled to bring the T3 up to cruising speed under load. Buyers overall reacted calmly. Most of the demand came from existing T2 owners simply upgrading to the new model. But even among new customers, despite the relatively high price and some initial hesitation, there was solid interest. In its first year, around 90,000 vehicles were sold, and by 1980, annual sales had climbed to 200,000. In February 1981, a 1.6-liter diesel engine was added to the lineup, a water-cooled inline-4 previously used in the Golf. Later that same year, in October, new water-cooled flat engines were introduced. These were essentially an evolution of the earlier air-cooled units, now housed in an aluminum case and still using a gear-driven camshaft setup. They were offered in 1.9 and 2.1-liter versions. Following these updates, sales continued to grow, reaching approximately 230,000 units in 1981. 1981 turned out to be an important year for the model. In September, Volkswagen introduced the Caravelle, essentially a more refined passenger version of the bus, with an upgraded interior including improved seat trim and full carpeting. From that point on, Volkswagen effectively split the T3 lineup into two directions. The commercial versions continued as the Transporter, while the passenger-oriented models were branded as the Caravelle. That said, as with the naming system, things were not entirely straightforward. For example, camper versions, previously known as the Westfalia Camper, were renamed the Joker. Dozens of companies, from large manufacturers to small workshops, produced camper conversions based on the T3. But the more important point is this: the T3 never became a symbol of counterculture. By the early 80s, that culture itself had largely faded. The associations with travel and freedom remained, of course, but by then it was no longer about rejecting the system. It had become a form of everyday leisure, which these camper versions were designed to serve. In 1985, a four-wheel drive version called the Syncro was introduced. It was offered with either 14-inch or 16-inch wheels. The 16-inch version was significantly more developed. It featured a longer wheelbase, strengthened suspension and drivetrain components, enlarged wheel arches, and more powerful brakes. In standard form, the Synchro did not come with locking differentials. However, buyers could optionally specify a rear differential lock, or both front and rear locks. This noticeably improved off-road capability, although the T3 was never intended to be a true off-road vehicle. In 1990, production of rear-engine T3 models in Europe came to an end, and the Synchro was discontinued 2 years later. It was replaced by the T4, a fundamentally new model with a front-mounted engine and front-wheel drive. This shift set the direction for all future generations of Volkswagen vans. But that was not the end of the T3. The model found a second life in South Africa, where production continued for more than a decade. South African versions looked almost identical to their European counterparts. The differences were minor, mainly in the ventilation openings, the grille, the headlights, and the larger side windows. Technically, however, these were quite different vehicles. They were fitted with inline 5-cylinder Audi engines with a displacement of 2.6 liters. Production at the plant in Uitenhage, now known as Cariega, continued until June 2002. Today, the T3 has almost disappeared from commercial use. You can still spot one on the road from time to time, but it's becoming increasingly rare. At the same time, interest among enthusiasts continues to grow. These vehicles are being restored, modified, and preserved. The T3 has aged well, and while it never achieved the same cult status as its predecessor, it played its role and did so with dignity.